Hi, good morning. How's everyone doing? My name is Michelle Zatlyn, and I started a company called Cloudflare about 6 years ago. And I'm super excited today to talk to you about what we're seeing going on in the changing landscape of security. But to understand what's going on in the changing landscape of security, you need to understand what's going on with the changing landscape of the web. So let's start there. So I'm proposing a new framework, the taxonomy of the cloud, where really if you're talking about cloud, which is a word we hear all day, all night, all the time, there are really 3 tiers of web infrastructure that you need to dive into to understand what's really going on. And a really high level, yesterday, it was all about capital expenses, software, and hardware. And what we're seeing going on right now in this changing landscape is a huge shift to operating expenses, services, and the cloud. And so what does that look like? So there are 3 tiers to web infrastructure. There's the store compute layer, there's the application layer, and then there's the network edge. And everyone commingles all of these words together. But you really need to understand each tier to have a conversation to understand what's going on and where there's opportunities and where there are challenges. So let's start on the store compute layer. In the world of yesterday, these were companies like EMC, Intel, Sun Microsystems, IBM's. It's when enterprises would buy hardware, the store compute from these vendors and host them on premise. So it was a CapEx expense. On that tier, there's a huge player that has a big head start, and it's called Amazon. So AWS has a huge head start in really owning the changing landscape on that tier. But they're not alone. Companies like Google has said there's no way Amazon can own this tier, and they're heavily investing. Companies that are on the yesterday side, like IBM and HP, are saying, wow, we want to be a piece of tomorrow, we're heavily investing in it. So there is a lot of expenditures going on that tier right now, and at that tier, scale really matters. And so you would assume that there are only going to be a few big players going forward because scale matters, it's very capital intensive. Again, as a customer, you're going from a CapEx to an operating expense. On the application tier, it's slightly different. So before there were really 3 big players. There was Microsoft, Oracle, and SAP. And enterprises bought one of these or all of these in-house. What we've seen is a huge unbundling. All of a sudden there are thousands and thousands of application providers who can build really big businesses based on functionality. So these are companies like Salesforce or Dropbox or Box or Workday, or companies who have been very successful the last few years, and they've taken advantage of this changing landscape of where before it was a software, and now companies are willing to buy services, and they're really excited about that. So what about the network edge? This is the tier of the cloud that no one really talks about. And in the old day, it was companies like Cisco, any sort of load balancing, any firewall, and there are a lot of firewalls, a DDoS mitigation, all of these different hardware providers. Companies would buy all of this hardware and host it on premise. But what you're seeing is a huge changing landscape, and what's happening is companies like Cloudflare or Akamai are playing out at the edge, and that's really what's dictating tomorrow. And again, it's going from this idea of hardware out to services out on the cloud. Okay, so this is kind of what's the context of what's happening. And so a little bit of just about Cloudflare, what we do. So it's all these things that you sit top of your rack if you're an enterprise, again, a lot of hardware boxes. And we basically have built a globally distributed network where it's fine-tuned for performance and security. So you sign up for our service by changing your DNS, and all of a sudden you get all the same benefits of the hardware that you used to get as a service out in the edge of the cloud. And so how's it going? We have about 5% of the web's requests flows through our network. We have about 2 million customers you've heard of. We're not really concentrated in any sort of vertical. And the reason why that matters is for every new customer that signs up for Cloudflare, we share the security data against one customer across the entire 2 million customers. So what that means is if somebody on the site gets attacked, you benefit from that threat intelligence, so the whole community is better. And so that's kind of what we do. So back to the landscape and to understanding what's going on. So if you draw kind of many to little to many, it used to look like an hour-shaped glass. And now it looks like a diamond. And the reason why that's the case is Before you had a lot of hardware providers, so the way that Oracle and SAP and Microsoft got really, really big wasn't necessarily because they were the best, it's because they worked across all of those different providers underneath of them. And because there were a few Microsofts, Oracles, and SAPs, there was a lot of different providers that sat on top. But now the inverse has happened. On the store compute layer, there's the AWSs, there's a couple really big players, and so that's enabled all these applications to become much less expensive to build, much easier. And then because there's so many different players on the application layer, that means there's going to be a couple really big players on the edge tier. Okay, so now that we understand what's going on in the changing landscape of the web, how does that impact security? So there's a couple really high-level themes. The first is this idea of convergence. Before, companies would buy performance and a certain type of security from all these different vendors, and you would interconnect them all. But what's really happening is there's a lot of convergence. Standalone security companies are shrinking. They're partnering or they're offering other services, because this idea of convergence is really important, as we saw on what's going on from the context shift. It also is happening on the application layer. You cannot buy a service from Workday and it not be secure. Workday has to build security fundamentally into their application from day one onwards. It's not an add-on. And so this idea of standalone security companies, over the years you're going to see a lot of them shrink, and there's going to be a lot more partnering and breadth, and fewer providers offering these different sorts of things. And on the application tier, it's definitely built in. So the second thing is more reach. So before, it was really the enterprises that we are worried about. The enterprises were the ones who got all of the security because it was very expensive. But because of what's going on, all of this shifting landscape, all of a sudden everyone needs to be protected. Small businesses have to be, otherwise they become impacted and used as part of the launching pad for these larger attacks. The mobile phones. Now that we all bring our personal devices into the workforce, we're all individual targets. And with the rise of mobile phones, that means we've had to rethink how security happens at both the device level and for all these small businesses. So whether you're a small business, this is my Visvon photobomb, or an individual blogger, what you're seeing is all of a sudden where security was really something that only enterprises bought, now there's solutions for end consumers, there are options for small businesses, and you're going to see more and more of that, where it's really opened up the market and the number of providers servicing those markets. In the United States alone, there are 13 million small businesses, and those are small businesses with at least one employee or more. If you count just the shell companies, it's more like 25 million, and so you can just think, wow, what a huge opportunity this is as we've brought the cost down and we've opened up the market, how big that market can be. All right, let's talk about ease of use. So I like to say that this is the killer feature. And so what does that mean? Well, I think the best thing to use is a case study. So Apple. One of the big threats was people had iPhones and they would get stolen. And all of a sudden think about how much personal information is on your phone. You have access to your emails, you have your whole contact list. And you have your banking apps and all these different sorts of things. And if your phone got stolen, of course, eventually you would, shut it off, but that takes time. And so there was this big security vulnerability. And so what Apple did is they tried to encourage all of us to put 4-digit passwords onto our phones. What percentage of people actually had PIN numbers, like the 4-digit securities, on their phones? It was less than 40%. So people just didn't do it because it was hard. They thought typing in the 4 digits was really painful. So in the iPhone 5, Apple introduced Touch ID, which is where with your fingerprint, it would unlock the phone. What percentage of people have adopted Touch ID on their phones? Over 80%. And so this is an example of where Apple took something where it's a security feature. Touch ID is a security feature, made it super simple, and there's been huge adoption. And as such, it's made everything more secure. And so in your own businesses, think, how can we do that? I think this is a really good illustration. At Cloudflare, we introduced something called Universal SSL in September of 2014. So the last, just a few months ago, 6 months ago. And what this is a very small percentage of web traffic goes over encrypted HTTPS. So when you type into your toolbar HTTPS, it was less than a percentage of all web requests went over HTTPS. And you ask why? Why weren't more websites enabling HTTPS for their sites? And the answer is it was very expensive because you had to buy SSL certificates, and it was technically difficult. You had to have a reasonably high level of technical sophistication to make sure your certificates were valid, to manage them, to work with your hosting providers, and there was a whole host of reasons. And as a result, a very small percentage of web traffic was encrypted. And all of us as web surfers on the internet should care. Because when you're at the airport going to one of your websites that you visit, those connections, if they're not encrypted, people can sniff them, there's a big vulnerability, and so we should all care. And so we said, hey, we can do something about this, where we sit. So we basically made SSL available to any web property on the internet. And overnight, we doubled the amount of web traffic going over HTTPS. And that was something our whole team was really proud of. And we basically said, you don't need to handle certificates anymore, you don't need to install anything. We did it on behalf of our customers, and we just made it simple. And so these are some examples of how ease of use in security is what you're going to hear a lot more about that over the coming years, and really something to think about and think, how can I do that in my own role or in my own company? And what I often hear is, oh yeah, but it's easy for you guys. Well, to sign up for Cloudflare, what you have to do is we have to take a copy of your DNS zone record, then you need to log into your registrar and update your authoritative name servers. For most people, they don't even understand what that means, and that's okay. The point is we took something that was very complicated and we made it less than 5 minutes for our customers to sign up. And that's how 5,000 people sign up today, every day. And so even though it was very hard, we shifted the work to our engineering team, and once we got the right flow down and the engineers did the right work on the back end, we made it very simple to our users. And it was the same with the Apple ID example. So something to think about. The fourth thing about the changes in security is it is becoming way more mainstream. Before, the security industry did itself a big disfavor for the last 10 years, where it was very isolated and it was their own teams. And what we're seeing is things are changing. And so how so? Do you remember this? This was Heartbleed last year. The vulnerability in OpenSSL last year, which a large percentage of the internet uses. So Heartbleed actually has a vulnerability name. It's like vulnerability RP1357. Not very catchy. So the people who found the bug, they created a logo for it, they branded it Heartbleed, and all of a sudden it was in the news. My mom was calling me saying, how much should I worry about Heartbleed? I mean, that's good. We want people talking about these different sorts of things. So you're going to see a lot more, the coverage of security in the news is a good thing. So Heartbleed's one example, but there are many more. The Interview, the spoof movie about North Korea, it's all about being hacked. Again, it's another way to bring this topic into mainstream, and lots of other sorts of things with the Sony hack and whatnot. So you're seeing it being talked about in the public, and that's really important. This guy you might recognize, that's President Obama, the President of the United States. He came to Stanford in February, and the White House did a cybersecurity summit at Stanford in February. And it was all about the government and the industry finding ways to work together, and because this is something that's not going away. And the fact, if you talk to the White House staffers, what they say is, had you told me 5 years ago President Obama was going to come out to California and do a 2-day cybersecurity summit, I would have said there's no way. But because of what's going on, you just see it's becoming much more mainstream, and so it's up to all of us to understand and be part of the conversation and make it accessible for everyone and for everyone to care about it. And so this is a big trend that's going to continue. And so finally, there's what's going on in terms of the threat landscape. And so this is a visual representation from Norse of the DDoS attacks going on. And we as a company see a lot of DDoS attacks going on. And what's going on is that the size of DDoS attacks is getting much larger, so they're getting much, much larger in scale, whereas before a large attack might be 10 or 20 gigabits per second, and now a large attack or an average attack is 80 to 100, so about 5 times the increase, and we've even seen them go up to as high as 300 and 400 gigabits per second. So those are really big changes in volumes. And we've also started to see them get a lot more sophisticated, where people are changing attack techniques to target end customers. And so the attackers are keeping pace. As industry solves problems, they keep changing methods. You also see a lot about personal accounts being hacked to get access to corporate accounts. And this either means your device or your personal Gmail or personal email account. And a lot of companies are spending a lot of time thinking about how do we mitigate this? How do we make it so our employees can still be productive and have access to the web and everything that they're going to do, but make sure that our corporate accounts stay safe? And this is a huge change that we've seen where companies are really being vigilant and going through a lot of exercises, just like when you were in junior or in grade school, you had to do like fire drills at school. Same sort of thing where they will do practice runs in-house that if something gets compromised, what happens? What's the game plan? Because of things like this. And the final thing that we've been seeing, or the other final change in what's going on, is that even if companies are super secure, okay? Let's say they're an application provider and they've done everything every step of the way, the attackers who really want to get to these companies, they find their weakest point, which is sometimes an outside vendor, and it's oftentimes the registrar. And so even though the company has amazing security practices, they'll go to an outside vendor that perhaps doesn't, in this case the registrars, and they take over the web domain and they point the traffic to a website they do control and can do whatever they'd like on it. And so a lot of the breaches we've seen recently is because they've been at the registrar. And this is something that enterprises in the industry are thinking, how do we make this more secure and keep pace with what's going on? So we've talked about a lot of changes. There's the change in the web, there's the change in security, and again, with change comes great opportunity, and which is very exciting. But there's one thing that certainly isn't changing, that the internet is still all about cat pictures, and that we love our kittens. Anyway, thank you for your time. Have a great day at the conference.